Okay, now we'll have a Tacoma Smelter Plume update from Ms. Elizabeth Weldin, the Technical Assistance Coordinator for Washington State Department of Ecology. Ms. Weldin.
Thank you, Mayor Richardson, Deputy Mayor Anderson, and council members. I'll be talking about the Tacoma Smelter Plume today. Before I get started, I have two people who are going to be helping me answer questions today. Amy Hargrove works with the Department of Ecology. She's the Soil Safety Program Coordinator. She has information, more information about park, child care, and cleanups that have happened here in Lakewood. And also John Sherman works for the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department, and he oversees free home soil testing. And he'll be able to answer more questions in regards to that. I've given you a copy of my presentation slides, and actually in the back, I also have a handout about healthy actions that John's staff put together from the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department that talks about healthy actions that can be done outside and inside in regards to contaminated soil from the Tacoma Smelter Plume. And also at the end of your packet, there's information about lead and arsenic health information. I'm going to briefly cover that tonight, but I won't spend too much time covering that. So basically tonight I'm going to be talking about the extent of the Tacoma Smelter Plume contamination. I'm going to be talking about the health risks for the Tacoma Smelter Plume, what Ecology has done, what Ecology is doing. And for you as council members, because you work with constituents day in and day out, be thinking through this presentation, how do we get the word out to residents of the city of Lakewood? Just briefly, as many of you may remember, the Sarco Smelter operated for about 100 years in the town of Ruston. And in 1986, it closed down. In 1983, 3 years earlier, it was declared a Superfund site by EPA. And in 1993, many of you may recall that the stack came down. It was 562 feet tall. And even though that stack's gone and EPA has pretty much wrapped up its cleanup, there is still area-wide contamination, and some of that contamination is here in the city of Lakewood. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So that stack that was at the Sarco smelter carried arsenic and lead up through the emissions and then spread through the wind, either to the north or south, depending on wind direction, and settled on surface soils. And we still to this day find lead and arsenic in the surface soils. Now it depends on how close the property is to where the Sarco smelter was. It also depends on if they were on a hilltop or on a ridge line. It also depends on if the person built the house, all their soil was scraped off and new soil was brought in. So one of the things that you'll hear me say a few times in this presentation is the amount of contamination varies from property to property. We really recommend that people sample their soils. Now there's a map here, and this map is of the Tacoma Smelter Plume. And this map is based on estimates by the help of sampling efforts taking place by 4 different county health departments, King, Pierce, Thurston, and Kitsap County. And this map is showing our estimated levels of arsenic contamination. And I just want to point out that we have found arsenic and lead contamination from the Sarco smelter as far north as West Seattle, as far south as Lacey, as far west as the Kitsap Peninsula, and as far east as Mercer Island and Bellevue. So what this map is showing, like I said, is our estimated levels of arsenic. Right here in the purple, that's the EPA Superfund site. So the entire town of Ruston is in that Superfund site, along with parts of North Tacoma. Those darker orange colors, those are areas with high levels of arsenic contamination. So we have communities such as University Place, North Tacoma, and Vashon Island that we found elevated levels of arsenic contamination. As the brilliance of the orange lessens, that basically represents less levels of estimated levels of arsenic. And once again, these are just estimates. We really recommend that people sample their soils to determine the level of arsenic and lead contamination they have. To zoom in a little bit more, this is the city of Lakewood. So basically, there's the boundary of Lakewood, I-5, and Lakewood fared pretty well compared to many of your other neighboring cities in regards to a Sarco contamination. There are parts of Lakewood that so far we have not found elevated levels of arsenic and lead. For instance, basically west of Bridgeport Way and Lakewood Drive southwest, we really haven't found elevated levels through our sampling efforts. The arsenic and lead that we have found have been at the moderate levels of contamination. And you may ask, why is there this gray area there? Basically, these maps are constantly being revised. And we have, when this map was put together, we didn't have information from that area. We have since then sampled around between American Lake and I-5 and Gravelly Lake and I-5, and we found moderate levels of contamination there. So why am I here today? Why are we even bringing this up? Well, arsenic and lead cause potential health effects. Arsenic causes heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, or could cause those. Lead can cause developmental delays, behavioral problems. And I get asked this question all the time. So does this mean that because I live here in the Tacoma Smelter Plume, I'm going to get cancer or heart disease? No, that's not what I'm saying. It's one of those risk factors. And we hear day in and day out all the different risk factors that can influence having heart disease and cancer. You hear them on the TV, like your age, your sex, your race, your heredity, what you eat, what you drink. These are all risk factors that play into if somebody is potentially going to get cancer or heart disease. But also being exposed to contaminated soil from the Tacoma Smelter Plume can be also one of those risk factors. But it also really depends on the toxicity, how high of concentration, and also how long. Here in the city of Lakewood, we are only finding moderate levels of contamination, in some cases no elevated levels of arsenic and lead. And also the question comes up, how long was the exposure? Did you grow up in the town of Ruston? Were you working at the Sarco facility? Or did you recently move here to the city of Lakewood from Arkansas and work in the office and don't have much exposure to contaminated soil? So the odds of developing these health problems really vary from person to person. So most people don't eat dirt. Except for kids, they can eat mud pies and everything. But usually what happens is our people are unintentionally ingesting contaminated soil. Children are chewing on dirty toys. They're chewing on their fingers are covered in dirt. They're chewing on pacifiers. These are all ways that they can unintentionally ingest soil that may be contaminated. Adults, when they're working out in their garden, may get soil on their arms, on their hands, on their face, and they may take a break. They may eat a sandwich, drink some water, smoke a cigarette, or put some chew in their mouth. And those are all ways that they can unintentionally eat dirt that may be contaminated. Also, if you're playing sports, baseball, soccer, anything that's out playing in the dirt, those are ways that people may unintentionally ingest some soil that may be contaminated. Construction workers, people who are landscapers, who are day in and day out working in the soil that may be contaminated. These are all people that may be potentially at risk. So what is the state of Washington doing about this? The Model Toxics Control Act regulates chemicals. Hundreds and hundreds of chemicals are regulated under this act. Arsenic and lead are regulated. The state of Washington has determined that at 20 parts per million and above, that there is a potential risk to human health. And for lead, anything over 250 parts per million, there is a potential risk to human health. And these cleanup levels that we call are basically based on toxicity, exposure, and long-term cancer risks. So a question I get a lot is, so is Ecology going to make us clean up the Tacoma Smelter Plume contamination? No, we're not. We just don't have the resources to do that. We don't have enough staff. We don't have enough money. We're just not able to do that. We could, in a situation where there is very high levels of contamination, much higher than there is here in the city of Lakewood, we could require somebody to clean up their piece of property. But right now, we don't have the resources, and we won't be getting the resources. So this is where we need your help as council members, is trying to get the word out about the Tacoma Smelter Plume, trying to figure out ways to educate the residents about the Tacoma Smelter Plume. We're trying to do outreach and education, talking about healthy actions people can do outside and inside. Outside, like wearing their gloves, washing fruits and vegetables, building raised beds, covering bare patches of soil, and dampening dusty soil. These are all ways to prevent dust from getting on people's hands and arms, and then them unintentionally ingesting the soil. Also encouraging healthy actions inside. hand washing, taking off shoes, cleaning toys, damp dusting. These are all ways to try to encourage people to keep that soil from going into their bodies. Also, we're offering free home soil testing to the city of Lakewood residents, and we really want to try to get the word out about that. This is a great way for people to find out if there is contaminated soil in their garden or around their play set. This is something that's being done in partnership with the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. What happens is an individual, this is one of John Sherman's employees, Glenn Rollins, he'll come out, or another member will come out and take a little bit of soil, send it into the lab, and this is all free of charge. We'll get the lab results back for lead and arsenic, and then Glenn will work with the landowner to come up with ideas. Maybe they have elevated levels of arsenic and lead in their garden. Glenn might suggest doing a raised bed with clean soil. Or he might find that there is elevated levels around their play equipment. Maybe putting down bark to keep kids from getting exposed to contaminated soils. This is all a free service, and we are trying to get the word out as part of our education and outreach so people know if they have contamination and what they can do about it. Also, we've been, and this is the work that Amy Hargrove has been doing sampling and cleanup for schools, licensed child cares, and parks in the city of Lakewood. All the schools in the city of Lakewood have been sampled, and we did find that three schools had elevated levels, but they were cleaned up in 2008. We've also sampled and cleaned up, or sampled all the licensed child cares in the city of Lakewood. There were 9 that we found that had elevated levels, and we completed the cleanup of those projects in 2011. I put ongoing here because if there is a new child care that becomes licensed by the state of Washington, we will offer up free soil sampling, and if they have elevated levels, we'll also clean up their property for them if they like, and that's at a voluntary level. Also parks, we have sampled all the parks with play areas in the city of Lakewood. We did find that there were 5 that were above the MOTCA cleanup level, so that's 20 parts per million and 250 parts per million. Later this year, we are slated to work with the Parks Department to clean up Kiwanis Park and American Lake Park. There are still 3 parks that we're still working with the Health Department to clean up: Washington Park, Harry Todd Park, and Fort Steilacoom Park. Finally, we're also trying to encourage voluntary cleanup, and I've been working with the Planning Department on this. It's trying for people that are coming in, building on an addition, a new single-family home, or building a plat, trying to encourage them to do soil sampling and also potentially cleanup of their property. We have guidance available for homeowners for if they would like to clean up their property, and we're also providing free technical assistance if somebody wants to go forward with cleaning up their property. My last 2 slides are contact information. Glenn Rollins works for John Sherman, the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. He would be who you'd contact for getting free home soil testing. And if you have any other questions, there's my contact information. And then finally, it was suggested that I provide the website and blog. Do you have any questions?
Questions by members of the council? Mr. Whalen.
What has been your experience with regard to the cost of a homeowner's voluntary compliance to clean up soil, for example, in Ruston or wherever, in a typical residential lot? Do they scrape the top 2 or 3 inches of soil and have it deposited somewhere?
So are you looking for the cost, or what exactly, or how much they're having to remove?
Well, we just chat about process and then cost, if you're aware.
Well, typically it's going to really depend on, so with soil sampling, we usually recommend you sample 6 to 12 inches down below to find out what the extent of the contamination is. And then usually we recommend that the soil be removed, but then there's also the possibility of capping the contaminated soil. If the concentrations are low, we recommend mixing the contaminated soil with cleaner soil. So as far as cost goes, it kind of depends on the extent of contamination and what is the option that they come up with. So if there was an individual property owner in the city of Lakewood that wanted to clean up their property, they could contact me and get a guidance document that goes through all the different options and figure out what would be the best option for them economically.
Mr. Brandstetter.
Yes, on your slide that where entitled, "Does Ecology Require Cleanup?" there's a bullet that says Ecology is encouraging local land use planning offices to advise or require landowners to sample soil and remediate. Given Lakewood's situation, are we really in a situation of where you're advising us to require something, or is the situation in Lakewood moderate enough or less pervasive that encourages the appropriate action for our land use planning purposes?
Well, the state of Washington feels that anything above 20 parts per million for arsenic and 250 parts per million for lead could potentially cause a health risk. Lakewood, as you pointed out, is kind of in the moderate levels of contamination. We're right now at the beginning stages working with your planning department, just trying to get the word out to people and letting them know about the contamination. A lot of people don't even know that the sarco contamination reached this far south. And so just letting them know about soil sampling and then also taking preventative measures right now, letting the construction workers on their project site know that there's contaminated soil, and then maybe thinking about cleaning up. But I mean, there's, right now, I've been meeting with Dan Catron, and there's no discussion right now of requiring, as far as I know, no requiring of sampling or removal. But right now we're at just the education stage. And that's why we're here tonight, to talk to you guys about how to educate and encourage people. There are some jurisdictions, like the city of Tacoma, the city of University Place, unincorporated Pierce County and unincorporated King County, that are starting to require, through the SEPA process, sampling and also cleanup. But it's at a very individual level, and the state is not doing an overall requirement or mandate for all jurisdictions to do that. It's at an individual jurisdiction level.
Okay. And then on another slide, you indicated that there had been a very specific concentrated effort at schools, parks, and child care centers. And particularly with respect to the child care centers, as businesses, that's still a voluntary, not a required or mandated action. Okay. When someone opens a new business as a child care center.
There was actually a law passed that the schools and licensed child cares all had to submit to sampling and actually clean up as well. So there was a law passed, and almost all licensed child cares and all of the schools have actually participated in our program. Those that haven't, we've been working with Department of Early Learning so that they either get notice out to their parents, but there's been so few, it hasn't been an issue getting into those licensed child cares.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Moss.
Thank you. You answered my question, so I'll have to find something else to say. But you were talking about ways to get the word out. I don't know what you've done, but I would suggest maybe our website for the city, and also through the schools. If there's a pamphlet that you could get out into the schools for the students to take home, that would be a good way to get some of the communication going.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Anderson.
Well, for those of us who have been in the area long enough, we remember prior to the 1974 era when the first pollution control, meaningful pollution control devices were put on the escargot stacks. You could actually see the plume. It was yellow. It caused practices in North Tacoma to be called off, and it killed grass. It didn't do, the visible part didn't come out here. And I'm fairly familiar with a number of studies regarding the health impact of exposure, but it's my understanding that the ones upon which these concerns are based are computer models. And I was wondering if you have any health studies indicating that there's a causal relationship between moderate level soil exposure at the levels you're discussing here in Lakewood and statistical indicators that there are higher or negative health outcomes, I would say, as opposed to just a computer model that says if a whole lot of this is bad for you, a little must be kind of bad for you.
Okay. So I'm going to try to answer your question, but I'm also going to open it up if my colleagues want to add anything more. So I think your question is also about epidemiological studies, if there's been any studies on people being affected by the Smelter too?
Yeah, at the levels we're talking about here
Yeah.
for soil contamination, are there any studies that actually show that there are negative health results of those as opposed to and real people, real results,
Yeah.
illnesses, as opposed to computer studies that say, well, we know if you have a certain level of arsenic, it'll kill you. If you have a certain level of arsenic, it'll make you
Yeah.
sick immediately. Some will make you sick in the long run, and extrapolate it down, saying, well, then if we take 1/100th of that, it's going to do 1/100th of the damage, or some other exponentially
Yeah. So-
extended.
We know that there's, and thank you for that question, we get that question a lot. There's information in your packet about what we know about the health effects for arsenic and lead, and we know that they cause for health risks. And basically, there's a whole bunch of risk factors that play in if there's an epidemiological study that can cause for somebody to get heart disease or cancer, and it's hard for us to tease out. Like there's been studies on the Reston Elementary School kids and also workers for the Smelter. It's hard to tease out what the risk factor and the causal relationship is because there's so many different factors, what somebody eats, what somebody drinks, a whole bunch of factors that play into if somebody gets cancer, heart disease. But we do know that lead does cause for behavioral problems and developmental delays. We do know that that arsenic causes for diabetes, cancer, and we know that the concentrations are at a slightly elevated level here in Lakewood, that there is a potential that could be one of the potential risk factors along with your diet, if you smoke, if you drink, that all play into that mix that could potentially cause cancer or heart disease. And I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything more to that, but there's no guarantee that you unintentionally eating dirt is going to cause you cancer. It's just one of those many risk factors out there, and we're trying to protect for that risk factor. Thanks.
Well, I was actually present, I forget the name of the park. I was present at the park when this chimney went down. I went out and participated in that, and I have the News Tribune front page photograph in poster form of that going down. So when we noticed that there were 5 parks that were found to have elevated levels, but there's still an additional 5 that we haven't completed. So those 5 were not amongst that list. It's still being worked.
So actually, no, we've sampled all of your parks, and 5 of them had some kind of elevation, 2 of which that had samples where we either had an average in a play area that was over 20 parts per million, and 1 that had some elevations very close to the play area. And we've been working with Mary Dodsworth in trying to come up with a plan to address those parks. The other 3 parks that are on the list, they've had maybe single elevations outside of the play area, so we're suggesting signage actually at those parks. We think that would be a better way to address those, and basically they're lower on Ecology's priority list for right now. And then the other 5 actually had no elevation, so they're good to go.
I'm just going to the slide to make sure I have it. So it's just coincidence there's 5 parks listed on the 3rd column, but they're not the 5 that had the elevated levels, or?
Those are the 5 parks that had the elevated levels: American Lake Kiwanis, Washington Park, Harry Todd, and Fort Steilacoom Park. And then there's a few additional parks that we also sampled, but they didn't have any elevated levels.
Okay, and so those 3 that are there, Washington and Harry Todd and Fort Steilacoom, there are
Yes.
some areas where you're just going to sign it?
Yes.
Okay.
At Fort Steilacoom Park, we had 6 play areas sampled. We had 1 play area with some elevations. very farther away from the play equipment. Washington Park, again, it's more in the woods at the Washington Park, but not actually in the play areas. So we feel like if we put some signage up so that if people are in the area and they can take some healthy actions. And Harry Todd, again, we had single elevations in the play areas that we've sampled further around and haven't found those elevations, so it could just be a random spike. But it also suggests that there's possibility also in those woods that you might run across it.
So again, with the colors on the slide with the map of Lakewood. So the areas in the dark orange are all over 40 or over 100 ppm on the lead?
Yeah, for the city of Lakewood, there are no areas so far that we've sampled that have greater than 100 parts per million. And for us, anything over 100 parts per million, for arsenic, we consider high levels of contamination. So for about a half, or a little bit more than half of Lakewood in the western part, kind of west of Bridgeport Way and Lakewood drives southwest, there we estimate between 40 to 100 parts per million for arsenic. But really, we want to emphasize soil sampling, and there's been a lot of development, as you know, and a lot of that soil might not be as contaminated because it's been taken off when somebody builds their house or when they build a building, and so that soil might not be there. And then there's a small portion that's just north of American Lake that we estimate is probably between 20 and 40. But same thing, soil sampling is really the key, and we are offering free home soil testing through the Pierce County Health Department where residents can find out what the level of contamination is for their property.
And is there a plan to go over to the Woodbrook portion of our community and sample, because it's currently in gray, which is not tested?
It has been tested right now. So when this map was done, we hadn't tested it, but the next time you see this map, it will actually show a moderate level of contamination. We are constantly updating these maps, and when we sampled the soil there, we found a moderate level of.
So you would expect it to be in the 20 to 40 range?
Probably, I think it's in the, do you want to answer that? 40.
Well, I just want to make a caveat about our map. Is that the map was created with data that was few and far between. It was when we were doing our footprint studies, so this was in 2000, 2005. And we took a lot of samples very far apart and then created a map with these little polygons that kind of say this is about the average and what we kind of suspect to find. We've actually sampled many more properties through the soil safety program with all the licensed child cares in the schools and the parks and camps that we actually have more data, and we'll be coming out with an updated map that can hopefully expand a little bit more on those areas and give you a better idea of the confidence level that we have with the parts per millions that you might find on a property.
Okay, Ms. Barth.
So, Ms. Weldin, if a citizen calls and takes advantage of the free soil and they find that there is contamination, are they required to do something?
We are not requiring anybody to do cleanup. We just don't have the staff or the resources to make anyone clean up Tacoma Smelter Plume contamination. The plume is 1,000 square miles. Over 700,000 properties are within the Tacoma Smelter Plume. We don't have the resources to do that. What we're hoping through the home soil testing is then people will know, oh, I have a little elevated level in my garden. Maybe I should do a raised bed and bring in clean soil and plant my vegetables there. That's our hope. It's part of our outreach and education part of the Tacoma Smelter Plume.
And one follow-up question, are your soil sample tests, are they being funded by the Superfund or?
It's being funded through a settlement that we received from the SARCO, and so that's how this whole entire project is being funded, through that settlement with the company.
Deputy Mayor Anderson.
If I'm reading your charts correctly, they all relate to arsenic. Have there been any findings of elevated leads levels in Lakewood?
There are, and basically the maps are usually the driver for our cleanup is arsenic. It's at a much lower level, causes for health effects, and so our maps have just shown arsenic and lead, but usually there's a correlation. If we find elevated levels of arsenic, we usually find elevated levels of lead.
But do you actually have any information about Lakewood with respect to elevated lead levels? Is there a map?
We don't have, we haven't created a map, but we do have, through Amy Hargrove's program, we have sampled the parks and schools and found elevated levels of arsenic and lead, and that's what we're hoping to clean up. And so with the cleanup efforts, we remove, because lead and arsenic are attached to the soil particle, when we remove the contaminated soil, we remove both those metals at the same time. And she's going to add more.
But most of our cleanups are arsenic-driven. Occasionally, we find lead. Sometimes lead is related to the Tacoma Smelter plume, but a lot of times it might be related to lead paint or some other issue that had gone on that property. For the soil safety program, we clean it up no matter what, and we don't, we try and make sure a play area is left with no arsenic or lead contamination. And I can only think of one child care, just out of the numbers that we've done, that I can think of that was lead-driven in Lakewood, so. But I could give you those numbers.
In the broader scope of this study, ranging from Snohomish County down, is there a direct correlation or ratio between arsenic and lead contamination, or do they precipitate out at different levels and different distances? Or
there is a correlation. So if you have 20 parts per million arsenic, you might have 120 parts per million lead or something like that. It's usually, I think, twice the number of arsenic. So at 20 parts per million, you might not have it above the cleanup level of 250 parts per million. But at 100 parts per million for arsenic, you're definitely going to be above the cleanup level for lead as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much.